Okay everybody, welcome back to the third part of this mini-series on creating a simple web chat application. So right now we're going to be showing how to create a Java web application that's going to handle the requests from the HTML JavaScript UI that I created in the previous videos. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Okay guys, let's go ahead and start creating the Java web application. So in Netbeans here, I'm just going to click on File, New Project. I have Java with Maven, and I'm going to select Web Application. Just give this a project name. I'll just call it Chat Web Application. I have two instances of Apache Tomcat downloaded. I have version 10 and I've named it in there as such, but I'm going to have it run on the other one that I have Apache 9. This is where I have the front-end application, the HTML, JavaScript, so I'm going to want this to run there so they can interface with each other. So just go ahead and click Finish, and it's going to generate the project for you. Okay, perfect. There it is on the left side. If you expand that and you expand the project files, I'm going to go ahead and update the pom.xml. So you can see here it comes with one dependency already, and this is used by the project for like Servlet requests from a front-end app like the HTML JavaScript. But we are going to add a couple other dependencies. So I'm just going to go ahead. So here are the two new dependencies. You can see here I do have a reference to JSON, which I'm going to use a little bit later, and I do have a reference to the PostgreSQL dependency. So I copied and pasted it here from another file that I already have with this, but if you wanted to know where you would get it, is you can go to the Maven repository here, and I'm already in the JSON page, but you would just type JSON. So let me just go back to the main page here. If I go ahead and type JSON, you'll see that first hit is Google JSON. Go ahead and click on that, and you're going to see the versions that you can use. And you can see the latest is a 2.9.0 that was released earlier this year. You click within here, and you'll have the Maven repository, or to say the dependency that you can use to copy and paste over here, which is exactly what I did. So you could do the same thing for PostgreSQL, and you'll grab the version that you would want, and it'll be here. So now we have the pom.xml file. Now let's go ahead and create. First, we're going to create a simple Java class here. We're going to call it message data. This Java file is not going to have any logic to it. This is just going to have variables that represent the fields in the database. So let me go ahead and get that. Okay, there's are the private variables. So let's go ahead and create methods for them. So you can right click on one, you can do a refactor here and do encapsulate fields, and you can actually automatically create the getters and setters for this. So it has by default the first one that you have selected. So if you go ahead and just click the rest and you click refactor, you're going to see that there is a getter method and a setter method for that variable, and they are getters and setters for the other variables that we have created. So I do like having the variables actually defined first and then the methods afterwards. So let's go ahead and just shuffle this around. Great. And let me go ahead and create a public constructor here. And I'm going to have this have 4 parameters which are going to correlate to each one of those private variables that we have. And inside here we're going to go ahead and have the class variable be set to the one passed in the parameters. So once again, I'm just going to go ahead and update this with what the purpose of this is for. Okay, that's that. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and create a couple of other files, but we're going to create the servlet that's going to handle the request from the actual HTML JavaScript pages that we have. So let me go ahead and just create a new package here just to kind of separate the actual ones with logic with just data types like this. So let's go ahead and just call this servlets. Perfect. And now we're going to go ahead and create one of the servlets. And you do right click, new, and we're not going to create just a Java class. This time we're going to create a servlet. And here we're going to call this get latest messages. Click on next. And here it's going to ask if you want to add this information to the web.xml file. I will actually say yes, click on the check mark, and then click finish. So you'll see this right now. It has some default methods in place. You can see that this message is actually an extension of HTTP servlet, since this is a servlet class. And you can see there's a process request here, and there are methods here to handle a get request and a post request, both of which is just going to call the process request method that's up here, which just has some standard boilerplate code where it's going to return just HTML content to be displayed to the front end. And then we have this last one that just says get servlet info, where you can just kind of put a description for the servlet. So now one thing to notice is that since we selected to put this in a web.xml, if you go ahead and open up web pages, open up web.inf, you'll see a web.xml. By default, this project or this XML file isn't here when you first create the project, but when you go through the process of creating a servlet and you select to have that checkbox checked, then any new servlet class you create is going to be located here. So you can see there is a servlet with the URL pattern get latest messages, and this is part of the URL string that's used by the front-end HTML application. And you see that the servlet name is get latest messages, and then up above here you can see how get latest messages is then mapped to the servlet class get latest messages. So here we go. So now let's go ahead and start implementing the functionality for this. Okay, I'm going to, again, just for time's sake, I'm going to go ahead and copy this from my other file that I have saved. And a lot of these you'll see is unused just because we didn't create the code that uses the object just yet. And I do have a failure here, and that's because just the package name path does not correlate to what I have here in this project. And you can see that I updated it to have the right package path, com, my company, chat, web application, message data. And you can see message data is within that same folder hierarchy, com, my company, chat, web application. So now let's go ahead and start creating the functionality here. And what I'm going to do first is actually just delete this, because we're not going to be using that. And what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and define this JSON array object. So you can tell from the name of this, this is going to hold the messages returned from the SQL statement that we're going to do in this class, which is going to get the latest messages, which is then going to be shown to the user as the chat history. And you can see here I'm invoking the JSON class object here, which is one of the dependencies that we pulled down in our pom.xml. If you remember here in the pom, I do have this dependency, JSON, and this is going to be a helper method or a helper class where it's going to help us, parse the object as a JSON object, and then that will be just easier for us to parse in the front-end web application. So now let's continue with this. Okay, so you can see here I created another array list. You might be asking why I have a JSON array and an array list here. So initially when we get the information out of the database, I'm going to be posting it into this array, and then using the JSON I'm going to be able to convert this array list into the JSON's JSON array object type. So let's go ahead and continue here. And we're going to have a try catch block here. And actually, before we even proceed with implementing what I'm going to put here in the try catch, one thing is important to know is that here I'm going to actually extract a connection from to the database as a JNDI data source within this web application. If you're not familiar with the JNDI data sources, let me go ahead and just kind of type it here. So if you look here in the documentation, essentially you can actually create code to just, connect directly to a database endpoint, right? So you can invoke like a new connection, driver manager.get connection, and specify the URL endpoint, and create a connection that way. But the way I'm going to be doing it here is I'm going to be creating a JNDI data source, which means instead of having the code explicitly have like the string here within the Java file, I'm going to reference a data source within the Apache Tomcat server, I should say within the web XML and context XML of this app. And it's going to have the information, the endpoint information there, so then I can create a connection that way. So it'll make a little bit more sense in a moment. So let me go ahead and just start doing that right now. So first things first, I'm going to go ahead and open up the context XML file. You'll see it. We have this here, context path chat web application, and I'm going to update this to be this. So something again that I copy and pasted from another file that I have, but you'll see here that it has the context path, and you'll see that this is an extra set of data, and this is going to be used to actually let me get rid of this duplicate here. This is going to be used by the app to reference the JNDI data source to get the endpoint to the database. So you'll see here there's a bunch of fields, and more importantly, I have a couple of fields blank for now, just for hiding the database endpoint. But you're going to have a URL where you're going to have the endpoint of the database. You're going to have the username for which to connect to, and then the password that you would use to connect to the database. So once again, if we go to the JNDI data source how-to for Apache Tomcat Server, there's going to have explanations here on how to connect to the database using JNDI data source, and they do actually have examples for each type of database. So here's for MySQL. Down below we have Oracle, and we are using a PostgreSQL database. So we over here at the PostgreSQL section, you'll see that they have references to what you need to do. And if you look here under 2b, there is a reference to the context XML, and that you need to update it to have this. So if you remember right, the URL that I had was blank in mine, but you're going to actually update it to have the endpoint that you see. Well, not here, but you're going to have the endpoint that you have. So if it's running on your local host, you would put JDBC PostgreSQL, and then 127.0.0.1, and then the default port for PostgreSQL is 5432. You specify the exact database, and that's it. That's all you have to do with the context XML. But in addition to that, you do have to update the web XML, and if you'll notice here, there is a reference name here that's JDBC Postgres, and notice that that actually matches up with the reference name that is over here. So if you look at the resource name, it's JDBC Postgres. Notice here the reference name is the same, so they do have to match up. So let's go back to our web XML and let's add that to ours. Okay, here is our resource refs referencing this JDBC Postgres reference or resource, and that's going to be defined in here. Okay, so now that we have that, we're going to go back to the code and actually start updating this to get the JNDI data source and connect to the database. And just as an FYI, what I'm going to do here is, once again, inside this Apache Tomcat Server documentation, you can see that at least within the PostgreSQL section, there is a section saying accessing the database, and you can see here it creates an initial context object, creates a data source, and it looks up the JDBC data source, and doing this, essentially, you can get a connection to the database. So let's go ahead and start doing that here. You'll notice here that this lookup actually has Java :comp env. That's just the standard for how you actually would put in here in this context lookup. But you can see that this second part here is what is going to correlate this lookup to the resource that we defined in the web XML. You can see it's JDBC Postgres, and also the context XML, which also has the name JDBC Postgres. So from here, let's just go to the next line. And you can see here, we're actually going to get a connection. And we're going to be setting that to the connection object that we defined up above. Now that we have a connection, we can actually create a statement object, and this is going to be used to help execute a SQL query that we're going to do in the database. And let's create this string here, which is actually going to contain the SQL statement that we're going to do in the database. So what we're going to do is select star. We want everything from the group messages table. And we're going to invoke this order by clause, which basically is saying we want to get basically the latest 2 messages that's posted in the database. And well, as I just said, we're going to get 2. So I have order by message ID in descending order and limit 2. So we just want 2, and we want to get the latest ones. So we don't want the first ones to show up in the chat history. We want to show just the latest 2. And then if we wanted to, we can make changes to the HTML to actually be able to scroll back up and then force the app to get the older data from the database. But for now, we just want to show the latest 2. So we have the query there. And now we can actually execute this query, and we're going to do this as follows. We are going to invoke this execute query statement on the statement object, and we're going to pass in the SQL query that we just created right now as a parameter. And the result's going to be set to this result set object called rs. So now we can go ahead and start parsing out the data. And now we're going to use that message data object that we created before. We're going to create a new instance of it, and we're going to pass in it the 4 parameters that we created in the constructor for it. Oh, hold on. Got that extra S there. And we're going to add that to the data array list that we have. And that's that. So here we're going to go ahead and call this collections.reverse, which from the name of it, as you can tell, it's just going to reverse the latest 2. Or I should say reverse the order of the data fields in this data array. And then now we're going to go ahead and assign the messages array, which is of type JSON array. And we're going to use JSON to basically convert this array list into this JSON array. So let's do messages array. Okay, great. So far so good. That's all we need up here. In the catch block, let's just go ahead and just log the error or the exception. And then we're going to have a finally block where we're going to close out the resources. So we're going to close out the connection objects. So we're going to do a quick check to see if it's not null. So if it's not null, that means we actually created a database connection to it. And then we're going to do con.close. This is going to throw a potential exception. So let's go ahead and left click here and just select surround statement with try catch. So that case is handled. And then after this catch, we're just going to go ahead and null the object. And then here we're going to go to the last try catch here with the print writer out. And here's where we're going to return the JSON array that we just created above. So we're going to do print line, and we're going to just simply pass in messages array. And this is going to be returned back to the HTML JavaScript file that we have. So now we should be able to compile this. So let's go ahead and do that. Oops, something is missing here. Let me see 1 second what this could be. Okay, it's complaining about the Maven Warp plugin 2.3. Let's go here. Here's a 2.3 version. Let's see if we can try a newer one that exists. So there is a 3.3.2. Save it. Let's do a clean and build. Okay, build now. Alright, now that we have the get latest messages in place, let's go ahead and create the other servlet that we need, which is gonna handle receiving the post message requests from the HTML application. So let's go here, and in the servlets package, let's right click, new servlet, and let's go ahead and call this post message servlet. Click next. Click this checkbox to add the information to the web XML, and click finish. So here we go. Just like with get latest messages, since this is a servlet, it's going to have some code already in here by default, which, for example, one is of it extending HTTP servlet. We have this process request, and we have just again this stuff that comes with a servlet: the do get method and the do post method, and a get servlet info. So let's go ahead and start creating the code needed for this. Okay, first things first, I'm going to go ahead and just copy all the imports that I need. Once again, they are unused right now, but once I create the code here, you're going to see how this is going to be used and no longer be unused, I should say. So first, we're going to create a few class variables. Okay, so this is going to be useful for us because this is going to help us parse out the data from the actual front-end application. So if I go here 1 second, and let me just kind of go back, and let's go to here. I'm sorry, not here. I'm going to go into this folder, and let's go ahead and open up the index.html. If you recall, I'll just scroll down here. When we post a message, we are creating this data form object or form data object, and you can see here that the key is user ID and the value is the actual user ID. Then you can see the key, username and user message. And so you can see here I have these variables that correlate to that, and these are going to be used to help us parse out the data received from the front-end application. So that's what that is. Now let's go ahead and create a few other variables. Okay, I created these 3 variables, which looks like they're the same as the above, minus the fact that they're not final and they're not capitalized. But this is going to help us determine when to start parsing out the user, specific fields, and these are going to actually contain the values. So I'm just going to go ahead and just make that comment to reflect that. Okay, and so for each post message, we're going to associate the ID and the name of the user that posted it, and you can see we have obviously the message that will be posted. And this is also used by the get latest messages, where it's going to extract this data as well. So we have the variables that we want here. So let's go ahead and actually start creating the code. So in the process request, we're going to do just like in the other servlet, we're going to just take this code out. And what we're going to do first is actually we're going to create a new method here called private boolean handle message, and for its parameters, we're just going to simply pass in the same two that are also part of process requests. And it's a boolean, so it's expecting to return something. So we will do that shortly. But for now, let's go ahead and go back up here. We're going to create a boolean status variable. And it's simply going to take the response from this, or the return value from this. And in this class here, or to say in this try catch, what we're going to do is simply return that. So we're going to do out.println, and we're going to just put the string statement here. Okay, so not too much context here right now, but all of the code, the heavy lifting of this servlet is going to be done in this method here. So let's just create a comment here, just indicating that this is going to post the user's messages to the database. Alright, so let's go to the next part of this method. Okay, so once again I'm copying and pasting this from another Java file that I have. And this is basically going to be extracting the user data from the front end. So I'm getting a getReader object from the request object. And here I'm parsing out or reading in everything that was sent from the front end. So you can see here I'm doing a while loop where I'm checking to make sure that we don't reach the end. So while reader.readline not equals null. And I'm checking to see if the specific line has the user ID key. This is going to let me know that the next line, a couple lines, is going to have the value, so I can go ahead and assign that. I do the same thing with the user message and the user name, and I'm going to demo this afterwards, but essentially in each one of these cases I do the same thing. I basically read ahead. I call reader.readline a couple of times because in the response, or to say in the data that is received, the value is actually 2 lines after like the key. So that's why I'm reading ahead 2 times, and then I just simply display another variable message which is going to read all the lines in and display it here. So it'll make more sense when we demo this. But now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create code to do the actual insert into the database. So let's go ahead and create a boolean status variable. We're going to default it to false. This is what's going to be returned in the end. And let's go ahead and create another try catch block. And here we're just going to simply just print the exception. And here we're going to do the exact same thing that we did in the other servlet, where we're going to create a connection to the database, but instead of doing a select query, we're going to do an insert command. So for the first part, let me go ahead and just copy what I have in get latest messages, which is these 3 lines here where I'm creating a new initial context object and then using that to do a lookup to get a reference to the JNDI data source and then actually getting a connection from that. So let's go here in the try catch and paste that. So looks good. And over here what we're going to do, now we're going to create a prepared statement. And we're going to be invoking this prepare statement from the connection object itself. And here we're going to do the insert command. So we're going to do insert into group, now let me spell this correctly, into group messages, which is the name of the database table that we created. And we're going to specify the columns that we want to insert into. So I'm listing them out here. And then we're going to type in values, and we're going to put 3 question marks. And the reason why we're doing 3 question marks, and this is basically a tactic to eliminate SQL injection that can happen into your application. And if you don't know, SQL injection is basically a way for hackers to actually invoke involuntary SQL commands into your database, which can be very dangerous because they can extract a whole bunch of information, including deleting and dropping every information that you have stored there. So we do not want that, and that is the purpose of a prepared statement. And the reason why we didn't do a prepared statement in the get latest messages is because we're not inserting anything into the database. We're simply performing a select query. So there's nothing that is passed in from the user here where they could put in malicious sequence of characters that could execute SQL code that you do not want. But since we are putting the user ID, username, and messages is the only real thing that the user enters that they could put bad SQL text together to execute stuff that you do not want to have executed, because that is something that's entered by the user. We want to protect the app, which is why we do a prepared statement. So the way you actually put the data into this is by doing the next few commands. You'll see here what I'm doing is I'm actually now retroactively backfilling the question mark with the value. So I'm doing set string, and you can see the value is 1, and this is basically referring to the first question mark here, and I am assigning it to be the user ID value. And if you see here, it's important to note this: when the insert command group messages is constructed, you can see here in the parentheses that user ID is the first thing in the list, which means the first question mark, the first column here, we want to put the user ID. So the next one is username. So if we do set string with column 2, we're going to have to put the username there because that's what the column expects. So let me just copy that 1 second, and I'll just replace user ID with user message. I'm sorry, username. And then let me update this column to be the second one. And then of course the third question mark correlates to this third field, which is the actual message. And this is the one that could cause the most danger to your application if you didn't protect against it. But we are protecting against it here, so we are safe. And I believe this is called just user message, so let's go ahead and copy and paste that there. Perfect. So now that that's done, we're going to go ahead and basically call the execute command on the p statement object. So the prepared statement, we're going to do execute. And this does return a boolean. Let's see if I can actually show the Java docs to this. See if it'll come up. If it doesn't, it's fine. But this can return, one of several things, boolean true or false, or I forget another object. I think it's a result set. So depending on the query you do, this can return a result set, but for insert commands, it won't. So it's going to be returning a boolean. So this is going to return it here, and then we're going to just basically return that back to the user. So let's go ahead and clean and build this. So I think what we have now is pretty much the Java code that we need for this whole application to start working. Alright, things are looking good. So actually one thing that we need to do before we run this, and when I say run, we're going to essentially launch this as a Java web application. What we need to do is put the PostgreSQL library within the Apache server itself. Because recall, once again, we are getting this as a JNDI data source, well, basically like database connection pooling through Apache Tomcat Server. So the Apache Tomcat Server has to have a reference to the basically driver manager for the database endpoint that you have. So if we go, let me go to my folder where I have Apache Tomcat Server. So there's Apache 9. If you go to the lib folder, okay, great. It looks like I already have it. But by default, when you first, install Apache Tomcat Server, at least this version, this doesn't have the PostgreSQL jar. So this is something you have to basically copy and paste into here. and then just restart your server if it's not already started, or if it started already. So I have it here, which is good, which means now we can actually go ahead and run this application. And this is going to force Apache Tomcat Server to start up. And you can see there's indications here that it's deploying this application. It's asking for our credentials for the Apache Tomcat Server. Perfect. You'll see that it's displaying this hello world and chat web application. You can ignore this. This is something, if you notice here, chat web application, there's an index.html file. The user is not going to have access to this. So, this is something you can kind of ignore, or you can even delete this, I believe, and there's no issues there. The front end to this app is the other HTML JavaScript file that we have created. So aside from that, let me double check something else. Okay. What I'm going to do here is restart the Keycloak instance that I have here. And the reason why this is important is because to really test out the back end, we need to have the user interaction on the front end. And the HTML JavaScript application that we have needs Keycloak to authenticate against. So that's why I am starting up Keycloak right now. And while that's starting up, let's go here to the Services tab, open up Servers, open up the Tomcat version that we have running. Looks like I have the old one running as well, or I should say the new one. So let's stop the new one because I don't care about Tomcat 10 at the moment. I am running this application within Tomcat 9. Let's open up the manager. Oh, let's see here. Let's see. Okay, maybe when I stop the newer one, I accidentally stopped this one here. Or maybe it was just confused that I had two Apache Tomcat servers running. So let me go ahead and just stop this one since I stopped the other one. And let's just start over. It looked like I had this other one already running. So it might have got confused and that's why I couldn't access the local manager page. But just as an FYI, Keycloak did fully initialize, as you can see here. And you can see that now I can go to localhost 8081 auth page, and from here, I can just log in if I wanted to. But let's go back here, and now that both are stopped, let me go ahead and launch the old one. Not necessarily old, it's Apache Tomcat 9, which is still very good, one of the newest ones, but old in the context that I have a newer 110 here. Okay, so it looks like it started up just fine, so let's go ahead and go down here, open in browser. Perfect, it's acting for my credentials. Okay, great, I am here now. Now if you notice, we have the chat web application here, which is looking good. And yeah, everything should be running now. So let me just make sure that, okay, yeah, I think this is running fine. So now let me go ahead and let me go ahead and actually launch the chat app. So let me just right click, open up this. It's forcing me to sign in. So now if I do test user, type the credentials, I log in. I'm logged in now. And you notice here actually something interesting is that I do have text chat history here in the chat history dialog box. Now you might be wondering why, because I didn't type anything just yet. And the reason why is because I did actually play around with this before and did have some test messages going on within the database itself. But you can see here I can type something else new right over here. And let's just say this. Hey there. And I post a message. And there it is. You can see that the post message query worked, because now the get latest message the post message insert command worked because the get latest messages query came back with that same message. And if you remember in my previous video, when I did an inspect here, we saw a bunch of 404s happening in the console log, and that's because the endpoints that the front-end app was trying to connect to didn't exist because this application was not there yet. So let me go ahead and open up Chrome. The chat's not really fun if no one else is in the chat. So I'm going to open up another browser and I'm going to launch this application. So I'm going to copy this URL. Okay, so now let's type that in and it's going to bring me to the login page. And so let me go ahead and log in with the other user that I have, the other test user. And you can see here, welcome John Smith for the first dialog, but, or to say in the Firefox browser, but in the Chrome that I just created or opened up, since I logged in as user 2, that actually has the name Adam Tarley. And then look here. See the chat history? It shows the exact same things. So you can see here that John Smith, who has the username test user, wrote the hey there message, and you can see in this other chat with this other user, you can see that hey there message with the user's username. This ID is not necessarily important to put here. I could have done without that, but let me just go ahead and type here hello. You'll see that you can see the hello over here, and that's being reflected in both. So once again, we have two queries or two messages coming back, and that's only because if you recall in the get latest messages, we do have this select command, which is basically limiting the number of responses to be 2. So if I go ahead and update this to be 4, and let me go ahead and recompile and run it, which will force it to be redeployed, we're going to see what happens afterwards. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's make sure that it's pointing to the... Okay, this is the old Servlet version 9, not version 10, so that's good. So let's go ahead and run this. Okay, that's how we know that it got relaunched fine, because it brings up the index.html that's part of this app, but we don't care about that. So now if you look here, now you can see more messages actually. So you see, what are you doing later? I'm going out to eat, and you can see the latest 2 that we typed. And so if I go to the other browser in Chrome, you'll see the same thing happening. Because since that get latest request is happening every couple of seconds, it automatically got the 4 messages and came back. So one improvement we can do here is have the scroll feature work a little bit better, automatically bring it down to the bottom, because you notice when it first came up that it was showing the oldest of the messages. So there's more messages than 4 in the database table, but in this particular chat we're returning 4, and you can see it's showing the first 3. So maybe we can just expand that dialog there since it's adjustable. Maybe that's okay for now, but that's a feature update we can do where we just make this automatically go to the bottom. So you can just see here, let me just type in this message. You can see Java's fun, Java's fun. And let's go ahead and be like, hell yeah, it is. Not too sure how many people actually say that, but let's go ahead and just pretend somebody does. So things are looking good. This is great. So we can go ahead and just do a quick logout here just so you can verify that the logout feature works. Okay, this is going to conclude the third part of this mini-series. So if you like it, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I will be putting out another video where it shows the first 3 videos combined, plus additional footage on how to debug the application from the HTML JavaScript point and also from the Java web application itself. So you can see how more of it makes sense when you actually click on the user interface.